Welcome back to the deep dive. We are back for another session, and honestly, today feels different. It feels heavier, but not in a bad news kind of way. It feels like gym heavy. Like we are about to walk up to a barbell that is loaded with way more weight than we usually handle, and we're going to try to lift it.
That is a very apt way to describe it. I
Yeah.
like that. It's the kind of heaviness that grounds you. It anchors you. That's the weight of reality versus um, the weightlessness of illusion.
Exactly. So, just to orient everyone listening, especially if you are new to this specific series, we are currently in week 2 of our analysis of the Tafsir Qur'an series. This is a journey through the lectures of Dr. Haider Riza. If you were with us last time, you know we sort of dipped our toes into the concept of the world, or dunya, as a place of distraction. But today we are not just dipping toes. We are diving right into the belly of the beast. We are talking about money. We are talking about sex. We are talking about status. And we are talking about children.
We're basically trying to decode the operating system of human desire. And before we go any further into this, I think it is incredibly important to acknowledge the architect of these insights. We are drawing from over 40 years of scholarship here. Dr. Haider Riza has dedicated a lifetime to Islamic mysticism and Quranic understanding, primarily reflecting the Shia school of thought. His work serves as a guide for so many seekers, and we are just here to try and unpack a fraction of that wisdom.
Absolutely. Deep gratitude to Dr. Haider Riza for that guidance. And because we want to be responsible with this material, especially given how deep and nuanced it is, I do have to read our standard disclaimer. The summary and explanations presented here are generated with the assistance of AI for lecture recap purposes. If any content is misunderstood, misinterpreted, or inaccurately conveyed, Dr. Haider Riza bears no responsibility for such inaccuracies.
A necessary piece of housekeeping. It ensures we approach this with the humility it requires.
Okay, let's get into the mission for today. We are unpacking a concept called hub shahawat, the love of desires. And honestly, looking at the source material, I think this is going to challenge a lot of us. It challenges me. It challenges the way I look at my bank account, my driveway, even my career goals.
It should. I mean, if this deep dive doesn't make you at least a little uncomfortable, we probably haven't done our job. The mission today is to fundamentally alter your definition of two words you use every single day: wealth and capital.
Here is the hook, and I want everyone listening to really pause and think about this. Look around you right now. If you're in your car, look at the dashboard. If you're at home, look at your furniture. Check your banking app on your phone. You call that your capital, right? That's your net worth. That's your assets.
And today's deep dive is going to argue that you are fundamentally confused. That house, that car, that bank balance, the source material suggests it isn't your capital at all. It's just decoration. It's just the wallpaper.
Which is a terrifying thought if you've spent your whole life trying to buy better wallpaper. So let's start at the foundation. We need to revisit the definition of the world. Last week, we introduced the terms law and la'ib, distraction and play. But Dr. Haider Riza makes a distinction here that I think is crucial, and we really need to unpack it because it changes everything.
It does. It really does. And this is where so many people get tripped up. When the Qur'an speaks negatively about the world or dunya, it is not talking about the planet Earth.
This was a light bulb moment for me reading the notes, because usually when you hear don't love the world, you think, okay, I guess I shouldn't like mountains or oceans or sunsets. But the lecture says the mountains and trees are not dunya.
No, that is creation. That is nature. And in this theological framework, creation is beautiful. It is a sign of God. It is meant to be appreciated. The lecture makes a very sharp distinction here. The physical earth is the stage. It's the hardware. But dunya, the worldly life, is the script. It is the time period. It is a system. It is a mental state characterized by distraction from the ultimate reality.
That is such a helpful distinction. It's the difference between the computer and the glitchy software running on it. So enjoying a sunset isn't being worldly, but scrolling through social media for 3 hours feeling jealous of someone else's vacation, that's dunya.
Precisely. It is the software of distraction running on the hardware of the planet. It's the game we get lost in. And the source material points to a specific verse that says this worldly life has been beautified. The term is zuyina. It has been made to look attractive to mankind.
Made to look attractive, that implies intent. That implies a designer.
It does. The lecture emphasizes that this is a design test. These distractions aren't just there by accident, they are actively magnetic. The phrase used is that the love of these desires has been decorated for us. It's not just that a shiny object is shiny, it's that your brain has been wired to chase the shine.
It's like a filter on a photo. The reality might be plain, but the Dunya filter makes it sparkle. And the lecture actually lists the magnets, the big 6. These are the specific categories of desire mentioned in the verse that trap us.
The big six. This is the inventory of human distraction. And what's fascinating is how timeless this list is. It was revealed 1,400 years ago, but it reads like a summary of modern consumer culture.
Let's run through them one by one, because when I saw this list, I thought, okay, this is ancient text, but then I realized, no, this is literally the algorithm of my Instagram feed. This is everything modern marketing is built on.
It is timeless. The first category is women, or broadly, the attraction to the opposite sex, partners.
Which is the most basic biological drive.
Yes, it is the fundamental drive for companionship and pleasure. And notice, the Qur'an doesn't say partners are bad. It says the love, the obsession, the distraction caused by this desire is the test. It's when the pursuit of a partner becomes the central axis of your existence, eclipsing everything else.
Right. It's the difference between having a healthy relationship and being completely consumed by lust or the need for validation from a partner. Okay, immediately following that is the second one, sons, or awalad.
Now, the lecture notes specifically clarify sons in the context of the revelation. We need to look at the anthropology here. Why sons specifically?
I assume because in that tribal society, sons were your workforce and your army.
Exactly. In the time of the revelation and in many cultures today, sons represented manpower. They represented defense. If you had 10 sons, you were safe. You were powerful. But it goes deeper. It represents lineage, legacy. Today, we might broaden this to family pride or dynasty.
It's the desire to continue oneself through others. It's the "my child is an honor student" bumper sticker, but on a genetic level. It's the idea that I will live on through my name.
Correct. It's an immortality project. We use our children to build a monument to ourselves. That is the trap. The love of sons isn't just loving your child, which is natural and good. It's loving the status that having powerful or successful children brings you.
Okay, that's a crucial nuance. We'll get back to parenting later because there's a huge section on that. Let's look at number 3, heaps of gold and silver.
The term used implies accumulation, not just a coin or two, heaps, stacks.
Which is just raw purchasing power, savings, crypto, stocks. It's the number on the screen.
It is the security and the potential that money represents. But notice the phrasing heaps. It's just hoarding. It's just gathering it just to look at it. The lecture points out that gold and silver are essentially useless metals unless they are circulated.
Yeah.
But we love the heap. We love the pile.
It's the Scrooge McDuck fantasy, swimming in the coins. It's the feeling of, I have enough to never worry again, but of course you always worry.
You always worry, because
Okay.
the heap can be stolen. The heap can devalue. But the desire for the heap is universal. Then comes the fourth one, and this is a very interesting one. The verse mentions branded horses, or musawama.
This one I loved. Branded horses. Dr. Haider Riza's lecture points out that these aren't just workhorses, they are marked.
Yes. Musawama comes from a root, meaning marked or badged. In the ancient world, you had a workhorse, which is like a tractor or a generic pickup truck. It did the job. And then you had the musawama horse, the thoroughbred, the one with the specific markings that showed its pedigree, the one that told everyone, I am important.
So we have to translate this to 2026. What is a marked mode of transport today? It's not just a car. It's a branded car. It's the badge on the hood.
It is the logo.
Yeah.
You aren't just buying transportation. You are buying the Mercedes TriStar. You are buying the Tesla T. You are buying the Porsche Crest.
That is so spot on, because if it was just about transport, we'd all be driving 10-year-old sedans that run fine. But we don't. We want the musawama.
It creates a hierarchy. I have the branded horse. You have the donkey. That is the zenot, the decoration. It's a status symbol. The utility is the same, getting from point A to point B, but the desire is for the status that comes with the arrival.
So it's not about the commute. It's about being seen commuting. It's about pulling up to the valet.
Correct. And notice how strong this pull is. People will go into debt for years just to have the branded horse. That is the power of ziyina, the beautification of the desire.
And the final two are cattle or livestock and tillage or land.
Which translates perfectly to modern economics as means of production in real estate.
Industry and property.
Exactly. Cattle represent your biological assets, your factories, your businesses, things that reproduce and generate income. And tillage is land, real estate, the desire to own territory.
So look at the list again. Sex partners, legacy children, cash crypto, status symbols cars, industry business, and real estate.
That is literally the entire global economy. That is every commercial I saw during the Super Bowl. That is every billboard you pass on the highway.
It covers everything. And here's where the trap lies. The lecture explains that humans make a fatal error in how they categorize these 6 things. We look at this list, our family, our portfolio, our land, our status car, and we call it Sarmaya. We call it our capital.
We define our worth by it. This is what I have. This is who I am.
But the reality, according to the Quranic perspective analyzed here, is that we are dead wrong.
We are confused. The source material argues that these are merely mata. That translates to provisions or tools, convenience. And they are zinat, which means decoration or scenery.
Wait, so my savings account, the thing I stress over every month, the thing I define my security by, is just scenery.
In the grand scheme of your existence, yes. The lecture argues that we suffer from an illusion of ownership. You think, I possess this gold, therefore I am rich. The expert analysis here is, no, you are simply standing on a stage that has a lot of gold props. You don't own the props, you were just using them for the scene.
That is a massive shift in perspective. If I'm just an actor on a set and the gold is a prop, then hoarding the props doesn't make me a better actor.
And it doesn't make the props yours after the curtain falls. That is the crux of it. When the play is over, the actor leaves the stage. He doesn't take the throne with him. He doesn't take the gold crown. He leaves as he came.
That puts a serious damper on my plans to buy a bigger house. But I get it. The problem, as Dr. Haider Riza points out, isn't the items themselves. We need to be clear on this. Islam isn't saying don't own things.
No, not at all. Gold is just a metal. Horses are just animals. Land is just dirt. The problem is explicitly described as hubbi shahawat, the love of these desires.
It's the emotional attachment. It's the glue that sticks our heart to the object.
It's when you confuse the tool for the goal. Let's use an analogy. Think about a hammer. A hammer is a wonderful tool if you want to build a house. It is necessary you should have a hammer.
Right. I can't build a house with my bare hands.
But imagine if you take that hammer and you start polishing it. You put it in a velvet box.
Yeah.
You put it in a glass case. You worship it. And when it comes time to build the house, you refuse to hit any nails with it because you might scratch the handle.
Then you never build the house.
Wow.
And you look like an idiot staring at a hammer.
Exactly. You have misunderstood the purpose of the hammer. The lecture argues that wealth is the hammer, status is the hammer, even influence is a hammer. When we love wealth, we stop using it as a tool to build our hereafter, or akira. We just admire the tool. We become obsessed with the tool, and we leave the eternal house unbuilt.
That is a powerful image. We are sitting in an empty lot, polishing our tools while the sun is going down.
And the source material contrasts this love of desires with something else. It says, with Allah is the excellent return, or husnul ma'ab.
It's offering a comparative. It's saying, look, you think this decorated stage is great. You think these props are valuable. I have news of something better.
Yes. It mentions gardens' purity, a state of existence that makes the branded horse look like a child's plastic toy. It's asking you to trade up. Don't settle for the scenery. Go for the reality.
So the strategy is about understanding where the real value lies. And this brings us to one of the most powerful stories in the lecture. I really want to spend some time on this anecdote from Irshad Al-Qulub, because for me, this is where the economics of this spiritual outlook really clicked.
This is the centerpiece of the lecture's argument. It is a perfect illustration of the economic strategy of a believer. It's a story that cuts through all the theoretical talk.
So set the scene for us.
Okay. There is a scholar and there is a young man. The young man has recently inherited a fortune, a massive amount of wealth. We're talking heaps of gold and silver. He is set for life.
The dream scenario.
For a dunyadar, a worldly person, yes. But this young man does something strange. Instead of investing it in more branded horses or real estate or buying a yacht, he starts spending it lavishly.
But not on himself.
No. He is solving people's problems. He is freeing slaves. He is feeding the poor. He is building infrastructure for the community. He is literally draining the account. He is writing checks as fast as he can.
And naturally, his mother is watching this, and she is freaking out, which, let's be honest, any parent listening would probably feel the same. She sees the bank balance dropping from millions to thousands and thinks he's ruining his future.
She thinks he is destroying his capital. She thinks he is becoming poor. She sees the numbers going down and assumes loss. So she goes to the scholar, a friend of the father, and says, please, talk to him. You are wise. Tell him to save some capital. Tell him to practice some restraint.
So the scholar agrees. He goes to confront the young man. He probably expects to give a lecture on budgeting and fiscal responsibility. But the young man's response, I mean, this is the aha moment of the episode for me.
It is brilliant logic. The young man looks at the scholar and asks a simple question. He says, "Sir, if I am moving from house A to house B, and I know for a fact that I will live in house B forever,
Mm.
and house A is just temporary, where should I send my furniture?"
Boom.
It's irrefutable. He says, "I'm not wasting my money. I'm transferring my capital from the place I am leaving, the dunya, to the place I'm going, the akira."
That reframes the entire concept of spending. We usually think if I give $100 to charity, that is minus $100 from my net worth. The young man is saying, no, that is a wire transfer to my permanent account.
And conversely, keeping the money in the bank here is actually losing it because you are leaving this house. Anything you leave in house A when you move to house B is lost to you. It belongs to the next tenant.
The next tenant being your heirs or the government.
Or the bank.
Precisely. So who is the smart investor? The one who leaves his furniture in the house he's being evicted from, or the one who ships it to the mansion he's moving into?
It makes hoarding look incredibly stupid. It's like stuffing cash into a mattress in a hotel room you're checking out of in an hour.
That is exactly the analogy. You are checking out. Why are you decorating the hotel room? Send the decorations home.
And the lecture quotes Imam Ali, A.S., here to drive this point home with a very stark dialogue. It describes the moment of death. The source material personifies three things: your wealth, your children, and your deeds. This is a famous narration. It visualizes the moment the soul is departing.
So let's play this out. You're on your deathbed. You spent your whole life accumulating these heaps of gold. You turn to your wealth. What does it say?
You ask your wealth, "I spent my life gathering you. I protected you. I counted you. What can you do for me now?" And wealth says, "I can only give you a shroud, a kafan." That's it. A few yards of white cloth to wrap your body. That is the purchasing power of a billionaire at the moment of death.
It stops at the skin. It cannot go further. Okay? Then you turn to your children, the legacy, the sons we talked about.
The dynasty.
Your children say, we will carry you to the grave. They will walk you to the gate. They will cry. They will bury you. But they cannot enter. They turn back at the dirt. They have to go back to their own lives.
And then you turn to your deeds, the things you did, the furniture you sent ahead, the charity, the kindness, the prayers.
And your deeds say, we will accompany you into the grave and beyond. We are the only thing that actually crosses the border with you. We are your new reality. This redefines everything. It redefines what an asset is. An asset isn't what sits in your driveway, it's what you sent ahead.
This is the true definition of zuhd, or asceticism, according to Dr. Haider Riza. And this is important. It doesn't mean you have to be poor.
Right, because that's the fear. People hear this and think, do I have to live in a cave and eat dry bread?
No. The lecture is very clear. You can have the wealth, you can live in a palace, you can drive the branded horse, but you must recognize the palace is a waiting room. You must recognize the horse is a rental.
It's about detachment. You can hold the wealth in your hand, but don't hold it in your heart.
Exactly. If it's in your hand, you can give it away easily. If it's in your heart, giving it away feels like tearing out a piece of yourself. That is the test. Can you let it go?
But this brings up a conflict I think a lot of us feel. We want to play both sides. We want the luxury of the world, and we want the reward of the hereafter. We want to be what the lecture calls balanced. But Dr. Haider Riza seems to think this popular notion of balance is a myth.
He challenges the popular notion of deen and dunya. You hear this all the time. I need to balance my religion and my worldly life.
Yeah.
Like it's a diet. A little bit of chocolate, a little bit of salad.
Right. I pray on Fridays, but I cut throat business deals on Mondays. I am religious at home, but I am secular at work.
The source material suggests that if you view them as separate entities to be balanced, you have already lost the plot. You're operating on a flawed premise.
Why?
Because, dunya, remember, our definition is distraction. It is illusion. Deen is truth. You cannot mix the illusion with the truth and expect the truth to remain pure. You cannot mix light and darkness and expect to keep the light perfect. The lecture makes a fascinating distinction between two types of people: the dunyadar, the worldly person, and the deendar, the religious person.
I can break this down because I think a lot of people listening might categorize themselves as religious because they pray or they go to the mosque or they fast. But the lecture says that's not enough to be deendar.
No, it's not. The lecture argues that for the dunyadar, even their religion becomes worldly.
What does that look like? Worldly religion. That sounds like an oxymoron.
It looks like praying to be seen as pious by your neighbors. It looks like holding a religious gathering, a majlis, not to learn or to mourn, but to show off your social status. Look at the catering I paid for. Look at the famous speaker I booked. Look at who sat in the front row.
So the activity is religious. They're literally reading scripture, but the color is worldly. It's painted with ego. It's painted with zenot. It's a branded horse disguised as a prayer mat.
Exactly. Their worship has the color of the world. Now contrast that with the Deendar. For the Deendar, their world becomes religious.
So their job, their family, their bank account, it all gets converted.
Yes, their wealth isn't just numbers. It's a tool for God's work. Their job isn't just a paycheck, it's a service to humanity. Their parenting isn't about ego, it's about raising a servant of truth. It's not about where you are, mosque versus office. It is about the orientation of your heart.
So a deendar can be a CEO.
Absolutely. If that CEO views their company as a way to employ people, create fair value, and uses the profit to serve the community, that CEO is in a state of worship. Their office is their mosque.
This reminds me of the water analogy from the lecture.
Yeah.
This was such a vivid image, and it really explains why hoarding is spiritually dangerous.
Dr. Haider Riza compares wealth to water. Wealth needs to flow. That is its nature.
If water flows over land, what happens?
It brings life. It creates greenery. Crops grow. Animals drink. This is wealth used for charity, for duty, for helping others. It moves. It nourishes. It is alive.
But if water pools in one place, if you dam it up,
it stagnates. It becomes a swamp. It starts to stink. It breeds disease. Mosquitoes come. The lecture says this is wealth hoarded and loved for itself. If you just collect it in a big pool, your bank account, and it never goes anywhere, spiritually, it begins to rot.
That is a disgusting but effective image. Nobody wants to be a swamp, but we are conditioned to build the biggest reservoir possible. Save for a rainy day. Build a nest egg.
And security is fine. Remember, the tool is fine. But if the reservoir becomes the goal, and the water never leaves, you are just the caretaker of a swamp. And that swamp will eventually drown you.
Let's pivot to one of the most sensitive parts of the Big Six, family, specifically children. The lecture uses the term fitna when talking about wealth and children. Now, usually when I hear fitna, I think of chaos or sedition, but here it means something else.
In the Quranic context, fitna means a trial or a test. It is something you're subjected to prove your quality, like gold being put in fire to test its purity.
This is a hard pill to swallow for parents. We view our kids as our rewards. My little angel, my joy. But the text says no, they are your test paper.
And specifically, the lecture warns against the asset fallacy regarding children. We often subconsciously view children as capital.
What do you mean by that?
My son will become a doctor. My daughter will marry into a wealthy family. They will take care of me when I am old. They will carry my name. They will validate my existence.
It's an investment strategy. I put 18 years of food and tuition into you. Now I expect a return on investment. I expect you to be what I want you to be.
Harsh, but true. And Dr. Haider Riza warns that this leads to inevitable disappointment.
Yeah.
Because if you view them as capital, you get crushed when they don't serve you, or when they leave, or when they have their own lives.
Or, God forbid, if they pass away, if you view them as your property, that loss is unbearable in a way that destroys you because you lost your asset.
But the alternative is to view them as a trust, an amanat. They are souls entrusted to you by God to be returned to God. You are the babysitter, not the owner.
The lecture brings up the ultimate example here. Imam Ali and Sayyida Fatima, essay.
The archetypes of the perfect believers. They had two sons, Imam Hassan and Imam Hussein, and two daughters, Zainab and Kulthum. Now, these are revered figures in history, but the lecture highlights that Imam Ali and Sayyida Fatima didn't raise them to serve the parents' ego. They didn't raise them to be successful in the worldly sense of branded horses and heaps of gold.
They raised them to serve the truth.
Yes. They viewed their children as trusts. Their goal was, let us polish these souls so they can serve God and humanity. And because of that, even when those children faced immense tragedy and martyrdom, which they did, the parents succeeded because the trust was delivered. They returned the souls to God in a pristine state.
That shifts the metric of parenting success. It's not, did my kid get into Harvard? It's, did my kid grow up to be a force for good?
Exactly. If you treat them as capital, you are setting yourself up for heartbreak. If you treat them as a trust, you succeed simply by raising them well, regardless of whether they pay you back.
I want to touch on the psychology of doing good, because the lecture goes into this really interesting discussion about gratitude. Ria's showing off.
This connects back to the swamp versus river analogy. The lecture asks a penetrating question. Why do we feel hurt when we help someone and they don't say thank you?
I mean, it's just rude, isn't it? If I loan you money or help you move house, a thanks would be nice. I
Yeah.
feel like I deserve that.
It would be nice. Socially, it's correct. But if the absence of it hurts you, if it makes you regret doing the good deed, the expert diagnosis here is that you are conducting a trade. You weren't trading with God. You were trading with that person.
What do you mean?
You gave labor or money, and you expected the currency of gratitude in return. You were selling a service. When they didn't thank you, the check bounced, and you got mad because you didn't get paid.
Wow. So I wasn't being charitable. I was being a merchant. I was buying praise.
Precisely. You were buying validation.
Mhm.
The lecture uses the water metaphor again. Does the river ask the land for a thank you note?
No, the river just flows.
Because that is its nature. A river flows because it is a river, not because the land deserves water. A believer does good because they are a believer, not because the recipient is grateful.
But is it wrong to feel good about doing good? I mean, if I donate to a charity, I get a warm, fuzzy feeling. Is that arrogance? Is that a trap?
The host asked this very question in the lecture's Q&A section. It's a fine line. The expert clarifies. If the feeling is shukr, gratitude to God, saying, thank you, God, for enabling me to do this, for giving me the means to help, that is healthy. That is spiritual.
But if the feeling is, man, I am such a great guy, look at me saving the world.
That is the trap. That is the ego taking credit for the river. You didn't make the water. You just let it flow.
There's also this concept of the forwarding mindset that helps here. If I believe I truly wired the money to my future house in the hereafter, then the person I gave it to here, the poor person, the charity, they are just the bank teller.
Yes.
You don't need the bank teller to praise you for making a deposit. You just need them to process the transaction.
That is a brilliant way to put it. They are the mailbox. You don't stand at the mailbox waiting for it to clap for you. You drop the letter and walk away, confident it will arrive.
I love that. It frees you. You don't need the validation anymore.
It liberates you from the tyranny of other people's opinions. And that is a huge part of escaping the illusion of capital.
We're getting towards the end, but I want to hit the practical side. Dr. Haider Riza took some questions, and there was a discussion about instincts, attraction, and repulsion. Because listening to this, you might think, desire is bad. I should kill my desires. I should be a robot.
And that would be wrong.
Yeah.
This is the biological necessity. The lecture clarifies that we aren't supposed to be robots. God created attraction, desire, and repulsion, anger, fear, for survival. You need desire to eat. You need desire to reproduce. You need fear to avoid walking off a cliff.
So the instinct isn't the sin. Being hungry isn't worldly.
No. The instinct is a tool, a blessing. The love of the instinct is the disease. The phrase used is, we eat to live. We don't live to eat.
Simple but difficult.
The lecture uses the school lab metaphor. Imagine the world's a chemistry lab in a school.
Okay, I'm picturing beakers, Bunsen burners, dangerous chemicals.
Right. You have acids, you have fragile glass. The rule of the lab is, use these things to learn the lesson. Conduct the experiment. Pass the test.
But don't drink the chemicals.
Don't drink the chemicals. And, crucially, don't try to stuff the Bunsen burner in your bag and take it home. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the school.
That's the capital versus decoration point again. We are trying to steal the lab equipment, thinking it's ours.
And in doing so, we fail the class. We get expelled.
So how do we break the spell, practically? The lecturer gives some advice on how to move from being a dunyadar to a deendar, because I can't just quit my job and give away my car today.
No, and you shouldn't. The first method is to reflect on endings. Look at the results of things. Wealth leaves you. Bodies fade. Status is forgotten. If you constantly remind yourself of the end of the movie, you won't get so caught up in the drama of the middle scenes.
Another tip was about relabeling, consciously changing the labels in your mind.
Yes, next time you look at your bank account, don't say my savings. Say God's trust fund for me. It changes how you spend it. You are the trustee, not the owner. If you are a trustee, you are careful. You look for the best place to invest it for the owner's sake.
And finally, community.
You cannot do this alone. The environment of branded horses is too strong. You need to surround yourself with people who remind you of reality. People who also see the world as a lab, not a playground.
It's like we said at the beginning, it's magnetic. If you are surrounded by magnets pulling you towards Dunya, you need some magnets pulling you the other way.
Precisely.
This has been intense, but I feel like we have a roadmap now. We started by asking if our house is our capital. I think the answer is a resounding no.
No. It is scenery. It is a tool. Your capital is your deeds, your character, and what you send forward.
We've covered the nature of the world as distraction, the trap of the big six desires, the strategy of the moving house, the incompatibility of loving the world and loving God simultaneously, and the test of family.
A comprehensive sweep of a very deep topic.
Here's where I want to leave the listeners today. A provocative closing thought, inspired by something the lecture touched on. It mentioned that knowledge is the greatest veil if it isn't applied.
A dangerous paradox.
We have sat here for an hour analyzing this. We feel smart, we understand the concepts, but the lecture warns that understanding is not becoming. The real test isn't listening to this deep dive.
The real test is 5 minutes from now.
Exactly. The next time you open your wallet, the next time you look at your car, the next time your child annoys you or makes you proud, can you honestly see those things as tools? Or do you still feel that tug of capital? Do you feel the possession?
That is the question. Are you a river flowing, or are you starting to smell like a swamp?
I think I'm going to be checking my own water quality for the rest of the week.
As should we all.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Again, our source was the tafsir of Dr. Haider Riza. Highly recommend going to the source if you can. And a respectful nod to the revered personalities mentioned today, Imam Ali and Sayyida Fatima, for the examples they set.
Indeed.
We'll see you in the next deep dive. Keep the water flowing.